So this is the woman who thinks she can move $3 billion with a signature. The voice carried across the glass-walled boardroom with the kind of polished arrogance money often mistakes for authority. A few people around the 40-foot conference table chuckled quietly, the sound bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, where late afternoon sunlight washed the skyline in gold. Jada Sterling stood at the end of the table, calm, composed, her navy blazer simple, her posture effortless, as if the room belonged to her long before anyone else walked in. Before typing the next slide, she noticed the assistant near the wall quietly lowering her eyes. And she noticed the billionaire leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had just won a small, meaningless victory. What no one in that boardroom understood, yet, was that Jada Sterling had not come here to win an argument. She had come to observe, to listen, to let the room reveal exactly what it believed about her before she decided how the next few minutes would unfold. Because while the board laughed and the billionaire dismissed her with the ease of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered, there was one quiet fact none of them had bothered to check. The deal they were celebrating, the expansion they were planning, the entire future this boardroom believed it was building together rested on a single stream of capital flowing from a fund whose name appeared only twice in the 100-page investment packet sitting in front of them. And that fund had one controlling partner, Jada Sterling. The boardroom remained warm with the aftertaste of laughter, the kind that lingered just long enough to convince everyone in the room that nothing serious had just happened. A 40-foot walnut conference table stretched beneath the glow of recessed lights, surrounded by 12 executives whose suits carried the quiet confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that moved markets. At the far wall, a screen displayed the title slide of the morning presentation, a projection that promised a 5-year expansion plan valued at nearly $8 billion. Charts glowed in shades of blue and silver while small lines of projected revenue climbed upward like carefully drawn mountains. Jada Sterling stood beside the chair reserved for visiting partners, her leather folders still closed, her expression unchanged. She did not rush to speak. She did not defend herself. Instead, she watched the room with the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that the most revealing moments happened when people believed no one important was paying attention. The billionaire who had refused her handshake leaned back again and tapped the polished table with a silver pen. His name was Victor Langford, a man whose investment empire had been built on aggressive acquisitions and louder press conferences. Financial networks liked to call him decisive. Employees who had worked for him usually used a different word. Langford glanced toward the chief executive officer at the head of the table and nodded toward the presentation screen. "Let us continue," he said, his voice smooth with the assumption of authority. The names were familiar institutions with long histories in commercial development. But the largest entry on the page belonged to a firm called Sterling Capital Group, a quiet investment fund known in certain circles for moving money with remarkable precision. The analyst glanced at the name for a moment longer than expected before advancing the slide. Around the table, no one commented. Victor Langford continued speaking as if the deal already belonged to him. He described the future of the company with the relaxed certainty of someone who believed he controlled every lever in the room. What he did not notice was that Jada Sterling had finally taken her seat and opened the leather folder in front of her. Inside were only 3 pages. Each page contained a single line of authorization that could redirect $3 billion before the next trading bell. The presentation continued as if nothing unusual had happened, but the atmosphere in the boardroom had shifted in a subtle way that only a few people could feel. Victor Langford now stood beside the screen, one hand resting casually on the back of his chair while he explained the final phase of the expansion strategy. His voice carried easily through the room, confident and polished, the voice of a man used to speaking while others listened. "According to our projections," he said, tapping the screen with the tip of his pen, "the Phoenix and Dallas developments alone will generate a combined annual return exceeding 12% within the first 60 months. Several members of the board nodded approvingly. One executive leaned forward and said that the numbers looked aggressive but promising. Another flipped through the investment packet again, scanning the financial breakdown with quick professional interest. Jada Sterling remained seated halfway down the table, the leather folder open in front of her, her attention focused not on the screen but on the people speaking. She had heard presentations like this for nearly 20 years. The language was always the same. Confidence wrapped in projections. Authority wrapped in assumptions. Victor Langford continued speaking and occasionally glanced toward her as if remembering that she was still in the room. At one point he paused and said with a faint smile, "Do not worry if some of this sounds complicated. Large-scale financing can feel overwhelming when you are new to these rooms." A few people around the table chuckled. Again, softer this time, but still loud enough to carry across the polished wood surface. One board member whispered something to the colleague beside him, and both of them smiled politely. The chief executive officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but did not interrupt. Jada lifted her eyes from the folder and looked toward Langford without the slightest trace of irritation. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a routine explanation. The analyst near the projector changed the slide again, and a chart appeared that displayed the layered structure of the deal, both hands on top of it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm enough that the room almost missed the first sentence. "That projection assumes the capital remains exactly where it is today," she said quietly. The room grew still for a moment as a few heads turned toward her. Victor Langford smiled with mild amusement and replied, "Of course it does. That is how financing works." Jada held his gaze without raising her voice. "Sometimes," she said, "financing moves." For a moment the boardroom remained suspended in the quiet that followed Jada Sterling's final sentence. "Sometimes financing moves." The words were not loud, but they carried a weight that did not match the casual confidence that had filled the room only seconds earlier. Victor Langford tilted his head slightly and smiled in the patient way someone does when he believes he is about to correct a misunderstanding. "Financing does not move during a meeting like this," he replied, his tone polished with mild amusement. "The capital partners signed their commitments months ago." Around the table, several executives nodded again, reassured by the familiar certainty in his voice. The chief executive officer glanced toward Jada briefly and then back to Langford, as if expecting the conversation to settle itself. But the quiet analyst standing beside the projector had not looked away from the investment packet still open in his hands. His name was Daniel Cho, a junior financial analyst who had joined the firm less than a year earlier. Daniel had spent most of the meeting advancing slides and adjusting charts without speaking, the way young employees often do in rooms where power sits heavy at the table. Yet something about the last exchange had pulled his attention back to page 37 of the packet. The page listed the institutional investors backing the expansion. Daniel traced the column of percentages again, this time slower, his eyes narrowing as he read the name that appeared beside the largest figure. Sterling Capital Group. He had seen that name before, not in the meeting materials, but in the research database he used during his training period. Sterling Capital was not a loud firm. It rarely issued press releases or attended industry conferences. But within investment circles, it carried a reputation for something far more influential than publicity. When Sterling Capital entered a project, the deal moved forward. When Sterling Capital withdrew, the deal usually disappeared. Daniel felt a small pulse of confusion in his chest and quietly opened the digital copy of the packet on his tablet. The same page appeared on the screen. The same percentage. 42% of the anchor capital. His eyes moved from the tablet to the long conference table where Jada Sterling sat with her hands resting calmly on a closed leather folder. The connection arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, like a puzzle piece sliding into place when the picture finally becomes clear. Sterling. The name repeated in his mind once more. Daniel looked again at the woman at the table, the one who had been treated as if she were an observer instead of a partner. He glanced toward Victor Langford, who was already speaking again, dismissing the conversation with the relaxed certainty that had defined the meeting from the beginning. "As I was saying," Langford continued, "the capital structure is secure. No serious investor pulls funding at the final stage of a project like this." The room responded with quiet agreement. One executive chuckled and said that moving capital now would be financial suicide. Another added that institutional investors valued stability more than anything else. Daniel swallowed and looked down at the tablet again. The numbers did not change. 42%. $3 billion. His gaze moved back toward Jada Sterling, who had now opened the folder again and was reviewing one of the pages inside, as if confirming something already decided. The calm in her expression did not match the growing realization in Daniel's mind. He leaned slightly toward the analyst beside him and whispered, almost to himself, "Do they know who she is?" The other analyst shook his head without looking up from the laptop in front of him. Across the table, Victor Langford finished his explanation and spread his hands as if presenting a conclusion that required no further debate. "This deal is locked," he said confidently. "Every partner here understands the long-term value of staying exactly where they are." Daniel Cho looked once more at the name printed on the page, and then at Jada Sterling sitting quietly in the same room where no one seemed to recognize it. And for the first time since the meeting began, he understood something the rest of the boardroom had completely missed. The largest capital partner in the entire deal had been sitting at the table the whole time. The boardroom settled again after Victor Langford's confident declaration, but the silence that followed felt different now, as if the air itself had begun paying closer attention. The skyline outside the glass walls glowed with the fading light of late afternoon, and the reflections of the executives around the table stretched across the polished surface like a quiet audience watching events unfold. Victor Langford rested both hands on the conference table and spoke with renewed certainty, the tone of a man convinced that the meeting had already reached its predictable ending. "As I said earlier," he continued, "serious investors do not play games with capital at the final stage of a project like this. The commitments are signed. The numbers are locked. This expansion moves forward exactly as planned." A few board members nodded immediately, relieved by the stability in his voice. One director leaned toward the chief executive officer and said that the timeline looked excellent for the next earnings report. Another adjusted his glasses and added that the markets would respond well to the announcement once construction began. Across the table, Jada Sterling listened without interrupting. Her hands remained folded over the closed leather folder in front of her, her posture calm, her expression neutral. The room interpreted that calm in the way people often do when they assume someone has no authority to challenge them. Victor Langford noticed her silence and smiled again, the same polite smile he had used earlier when refusing her handshake. "You see," he said lightly, "this is what happens when experienced investors work together. The system functions smoothly because everyone here understands their role." A faint ripple of laughter passed around the table again. The chief executive officer shifted slightly in his chair, but still said nothing. Only one person in the room did not seem comfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Daniel Cho stood near the projector with the investment packet still open in his hands, his eyes moving again between the printed page and the woman seated halfway down the table. The numbers on page 37 had not changed. 42% of the anchor capital still belonged to Sterling Capital Group. $3 billion still stood behind that single line in the document. And the woman whose last name matched that firm was sitting quietly while the boardroom continued speaking as if she were invisible. Daniel felt a small tightening in his chest, the kind that comes when someone realizes a mistake has already traveled too far to be easily corrected. He looked toward Victor Langford and then back toward the chief executive officer, wondering if either of them had noticed what he had just discovered. But the conversation at the table continued to drift further away from that possibility. Langford leaned back and crossed his arms with the relaxed satisfaction of someone closing a successful negotiation. "This partnership is built on reliability," he said. "No investor in this room would jeopardize a project of this scale simply because of a personal disagreement." The words hung in the air for a moment before Jada Sterling finally lifted her eyes from the folder in front of her. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried the same steady calm that had defined every moment of her presence in the room. "Reliability is important," she said quietly, "but respect is usually part of the same agreement." Several heads turned toward her again, though this time the laughter did not follow. Victor Langford tilted his head slightly, amused more than concerned. "Respect," he repeated, as if testing the word. "This is business, Miss Sterling. People do not move billions of dollars based on feelings." Jada Sterling held his gaze without the slightest change in her expression. "You are right," she replied. "People move billions of dollars based on decisions." The room fell quiet once more. Daniel Cho felt the realization settle deeper in his mind as he watched the exchange. Victor Langford believed the deal was immovable because he believed he understood where the power in the room was coming from. But the calm confidence in Jada Sterling's voice suggested something very different. She reached for the folder again and slowly opened it, revealing the 3 pages inside that had been waiting untouched since the meeting began. Around the table, several executives leaned forward slightly, sensing that the quiet rhythm of the meeting was beginning to change. Victor Langford watched her with mild curiosity, still convinced that whatever she intended to say would have little effect on the structure he believed was already secure. What he did not yet understand was that the most important decision in the entire expansion had not been made months ago when the contracts were signed. It was about to be made in the next few minutes. The boardroom had grown so quiet that even the faint hum of the building's ventilation system seemed louder than before. Outside the tall glass windows, Manhattan had begun slipping into early evening, the sky turning a pale amber behind rows of steel towers. Inside the room, every set of eyes slowly returned to Jada Sterling as she opened the leather folder in front of her. The movement was unhurried, almost ordinary, yet the effect it had on the atmosphere was immediate. Conversations that had been drifting across the table only seconds earlier disappeared completely. Victor Langford watched with mild curiosity, still leaning comfortably in his chair, his expression carrying the easy confidence of a man who believed he understood every possible outcome in the room. Jada slid the first page out of the folder and placed it gently on the polished wood surface in front of her. The paper itself was simple. A single authorization document printed in black ink, the kind used by institutional investors when capital allocations needed to be adjusted quickly. She glanced down at the page once more, as if confirming that the decision had already been made long before the meeting began. Then she reached for her phone resting beside the folder. The gesture caught the attention of several board members who had not been watching closely before. One executive leaned forward slightly, while another adjusted his glasses and followed the movement with quiet curiosity. Victor Langford raised an eyebrow and let out a small, amused breath. "If you are checking your calendar, Miss Sterling," he said lightly, "I assure you the most important part of the meeting is already finished." A few people around the table smiled again, though the laughter felt thinner this time. Jada Sterling did not respond to the remark. She unlocked the phone, scrolled once through her contacts, and tapped a single name. The call connected almost instantly. "Good afternoon, Carla," she said calmly into the phone. Her voice was steady enough that the room could hear every word without her raising it. "Yes, I am still in the meeting." There was a brief pause while the assistant on the other end responded. Around the table, several executives exchanged quiet glances, unsure why the conversation was happening in the middle of the meeting. Victor Langford leaned back farther in his chair, still watching with relaxed amusement. Jada listened for another moment before speaking again. "Please open the Sterling Capital allocation file for the Horizon expansion project," she said. "Then prepare the withdrawal authorization." The words landed in the room with the soft clarity of a sentence no one had expected to hear. For a moment, no one spoke. The chief executive officer looked up sharply from the papers in front of him, as if he had misheard something. Victor Langford's smile remained on his face, but it had begun to stiffen slightly around the edges. "Withdrawal authorization," he repeated slowly, almost as if testing the phrase in his own mind. Jada Sterling continued the call without acknowledging the interruption. "Yes, the full amount," she said into the phone. $3 billion. Redirect the capital back to the primary Sterling account and notify the legal team that the commitment is being terminated effective immediately. Across the table, Daniel Cho felt his pulse quicken as the meaning of the words spread through the room. Several board members straightened in their chairs while others began flipping rapidly through the investment packet again, as if searching for confirmation that they had understood correctly. Victor Langford leaned forward now, the relaxed posture gone from his shoulders. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said carefully. "You cannot simply move institutional funding in the middle of a board meeting." Jada ended the call and placed the phone back on the table with quiet precision. Then she looked directly at him for the first time since the meeting began. "Actually," she said calmly, "I can." The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls themselves had moved closer to the table. The chief executive officer looked down at the documents in front of him and then back toward Jada with growing alarm. Victor Langford opened his mouth to respond, but the confidence that had filled his voice earlier seemed to hesitate before it arrived. Jada Sterling folded her hands again over the open folder. The authorization page still rested on the table between them, waiting for the signature that would send $3 billion moving out of the deal everyone else had just finished celebrating. The silence that followed Jada Sterling's final sentence felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the meeting. $3 billion. The number lingered in the air like an echo. No one wanted to acknowledge out loud. For several seconds, no one around the 40-foot conference table spoke. The skyline outside the windows had darkened slightly as the evening light began slipping between the towers of Manhattan, and the reflections of the executives sitting around the room looked strangely smaller against the glass. Victor Langford was the first to recover enough to speak, though the confidence that had filled his voice earlier now carried a sharp edge of disbelief. "That is not possible," he said slowly. "The commitment from Sterling Capital is locked into the project agreement. Institutional investors do not reverse funding simply because they are unhappy during a meeting." Jada Sterling watched him with the same calm expression she had carried since the moment she walked into the room. Her hands remained folded neatly over the folder on the table, the authorization document still resting in front of her. "You are correct about one thing," she replied evenly. "Institutional investors do not move capital because they are unhappy." The chief executive officer leaned forward quickly, his voice suddenly urgent. "Miss Sterling, perhaps we should pause for a moment and discuss this privately before any final decisions are made." Victor Langford turned toward him with visible irritation. "There is no decision to discuss," he said firmly. "This is a misunderstanding." Then he looked back toward Jada and spoke with renewed force. "Your firm would never jeopardize a project of this scale. $3 billion is not something that simply disappears because of a disagreement." Across the table, Daniel Cho watched the exchange with a growing awareness that the entire balance of the room had shifted. The confidence that had once belonged to Victor Langford was now resting quietly with the woman he had dismissed earlier in the meeting. Jada Sterling lifted the authorization page from the table and glanced at it once more before setting it down again. "I agree that $3 billion is not something that disappears lightly," she said calmly. "That is exactly why it is important to know who controls it." The room went still again. Victor Langford frowned slightly as if trying to understand the direction of the conversation. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. Jada Sterling finally leaned forward just enough that every person at the table could hear the next sentence clearly. "You refused to shake my hand earlier today," she said. "You told this room that you prefer to do business with people who actually built something." Victor Langford opened his mouth to respond, but she continued before he could interrupt. "What you did not bother to ask," she said quietly, "is who built the capital structure supporting this entire expansion." The chief executive officer looked quickly toward the investment packet again, flipping the pages until he reached the capital breakdown near the center of the document. His expression changed almost instantly. Across the table, one of the board members leaned over his shoulder and whispered something under his breath. Victor Langford followed their gaze toward the page, and for the first time since the meeting began, his confidence faltered. Jada Sterling let the silence stretch long enough for the realization to move through the room. Then she spoke again, her voice steady and precise. "Sterling Capital Group holds 42% of the anchor funding for this project. That is $3 billion. And I am the controlling partner of that firm." The words settled into the room with a final clarity no one could ignore. Daniel Cho watched as several executives slowly lowered their papers back onto the table, their earlier certainty replaced by a quiet shock. Victor Langford stared at the document in front of him, the pieces of the situation rearranging themselves in his mind one by one. Jada Sterling rose calmly from her chair and straightened the folder in front of her. "You believed I did not belong at this table," she said softly. "In reality, this table exists because my firm decided to build it. And now that decision has changed." The words settled across the boardroom with a weight that no one could laugh away this time. "Sterling Capital Group holds 42% of the anchor funding for this project. That is $3 billion. And I am the controlling partner of that firm." For several long seconds, no one moved. The skyline outside the glass walls had dimmed into the soft gray light of early evening, and the reflection of the long conference table stretched across the windows like a silent witness to what had just been revealed. Victor Langford remained seated, but the confidence that had filled his posture earlier had drained from his shoulders. His eyes moved quickly from Jada Sterling to the open investment packet still lying in front of him. The number was still there, 42%. The same number Daniel Cho had noticed earlier, the same number that now seemed to glow on the page like a warning that should have been obvious from the beginning. The chief executive officer leaned forward abruptly, flipping through the packet again, as if hoping the numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked closely enough. His voice came out lower than before. "Miss Sterling," he said carefully, "perhaps we can discuss an alternative before any formal withdrawal takes place." Victor Langford finally pushed his chair back slightly and stood, his expression tightening as he tried to regain the authority he had carried so easily at the start of the meeting. "You cannot be serious," he said, his voice sharper now. "Pulling $3 billion from this deal would destabilize the entire expansion." Jada Sterling remained standing beside the table, her calm presence unchanged. She closed the leather folder slowly, the sound of the clasp snapping into place echoing faintly across the room. "I am aware of the consequences," she replied evenly. Victor Langford stepped closer to the table and placed both hands against the polished wood surface as if anchoring himself in the argument. "Then let us act like professionals," he said. "Whatever misunderstanding occurred earlier can be corrected. The partnership between your firm and this board benefits everyone involved." Jada looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. "What happened earlier was not a misunderstanding," she said. "It was an assumption." Around the table, several executives avoided eye contact, suddenly aware of how easily the tone of the meeting had shifted. One director cleared his throat and looked down at his notes. Another leaned back slowly in his chair, as if trying to distance himself from the conversation unfolding at the center of the room. Victor Langford exhaled sharply and shook his head. "You are going to collapse an $8 billion expansion because of a handshake," he said incredulously. Jada Sterling's expression did not change. "No," she replied calmly. "The handshake simply revealed a problem that already existed." The room grew still again. Daniel Cho watched as the meaning of her words moved quietly across the faces of the board members sitting around the table. The issue had never been about the handshake itself. It had been about what it represented. Victor Langford looked around the room as if expecting someone else to challenge her decision, but the executives who had laughed earlier now remained silent. The chief executive officer finally spoke again, his voice measured and cautious. "If Sterling Capital withdraws its commitment today," he said slowly, "this project will not move forward." "That is correct," Jada replied. Another long silence followed. Outside the windows, the lights of the city were beginning to flicker on one by one across the skyline. Inside the boardroom, the weight of the decision settled over the table like a closing door. Victor Langford straightened his jacket and looked at Jada again, this time without the earlier amusement in his voice. "What exactly do you expect to accomplish with this?" he asked. Jada Sterling picked up the authorization page from the folder and held it lightly between her fingers. "Respect," she said quietly, "is not something people request after a meeting. It is something they demonstrate before it begins." Then she set the paper back onto the table, the document that would remove $3 billion from the expansion resting clearly in view of everyone in the room. For the first time since the meeting had started, Victor Langford had nothing left to say. The boardroom remained frozen in the quiet that followed Jada Sterling's final words. "Respect is not something people request after a meeting. It is something they demonstrate before it begins." The sentence settled over the long walnut table like a final line in a contract that could not be revised. Outside the glass walls, the city of Manhattan had fully shifted into evening, the windows of nearby towers glowing with thousands of office lights, while traffic moved slowly along the avenues far below. Inside the room, the executives who had spent the past hour discussing an $8 billion expansion now sat in complete silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the unmistakable realization that the foundation of their plan had just been removed. Victor Langford remained standing at the edge of the table, his hands still resting against the polished surface, but the authority that had once filled his posture had faded into something closer to disbelief. For a moment, he looked down at the investment packet again, staring at the line that listed Sterling Capital Group beside the largest share of the anchor funding. The number had been in front of him the entire time. 42%. $3 billion. Yet he had never thought to ask the one question that mattered. The chief executive officer slowly closed the folder in front of him and leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter than it had been at any point during the meeting. "Ms. Sterling," he said carefully, "if the withdrawal is finalized today, The expansion project will have to be postponed indefinitely. Jada Sterling nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact she had already considered long before walking into the room. That is correct, she replied calmly. Daniel Cho watched from beside the projector as the truth of that statement moved around the table. Some executives lowered their eyes to their notes, while others stared silently toward the windows, each of them calculating the consequences in their own way. The excitement that had filled the meeting earlier had vanished completely. Victor Langford finally straightened his jacket and looked at Jada again, this time without the dismissive smile that had defined his first impression of her. For a brief second it seemed as if he might try to argue again, but the words did not come. The reality of the situation had already arrived. Jada Sterling picked up the authorization page from the table and signed it with a steady motion of her pen. The sound of the paper sliding back into the folder was soft, but unmistakable. $3 billion had just changed direction. She closed the folder once more and rested it under her arm before stepping away from the chair she had occupied during the meeting. The movement drew every eye in the room toward her again. Before leaving, she paused briefly and looked across the table at the executives who had spent the past hour deciding who belonged in the conversation and who did not. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again. Power does not come from the loudest voice in the room, she said. It comes from understanding who is actually building the room in the first place. No one responded. Victor Langford watched her in silence as she turned and walked toward the glass doors at the far end of the boardroom. The assistant outside the room opened the door as she approached, and the quiet hum of the hallway replaced the heavy stillness behind her. Inside the boardroom, the executives remained seated around the long table, the investment packet still open to the page that revealed the capital structure they had taken for granted. Daniel Cho glanced one last time at the line that listed Sterling Capital Group before slowly closing the document. The meeting that had begun with laughter and assumptions had ended with a lesson none of them would forget. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone else fails to recognize until it is already too late.